right, we are back for section 3 of Criminology, and we're still talking about deterrence, but now we're kind of talking about modern applications and measures of deterrence, right? So how does deterrence work here in the real world? So, first off, funny internet picture of the section. This always happened to me as a student, right? You know, I've gone to class the last 10 times and it was only stuff we covered in the book, and then I'm not feeling well, I'm not going to go to class. So I don't go to class. And then there's a whole bunch of really important information and none of it's in the book. And so, moral of the story, go to class every time, make sure you show up. When I teach at my university, my classes really are not that difficult if you show up and pay attention. If you do those two things, that'll get you 90-95% of the way through my class, any other college class, or really kind of life. Just show up and pay attention. It's not that hard. So, academic research and tests of deterrence. They've done a whole bunch of them. And the general kind of takeaway from this research, when you look at the big picture, we find that certainty, you can find some evidence that will reduce crime. Okay, if you can increase the certainty of punishment, that might have some effect on reducing crime. Swiftness and severity, probably not. Like, there is essentially zero evidence that either one of those really will reduce crime. On the other hand, one thing that kind of argues in deterrence's favor is that the vast majority of criminals are one-timers, right? The vast majority of people who are arrested will never be arrested again in their life. There are people, that kind of the media focuses on where their rap sheet's a mile long and they have, they've committed this crime and this crime and this crime and blah, blah, blah. But they're relatively very few and far between. Again, the vast majority of people who are arrested once will never be arrested again, which kind of does speak a little bit towards we punish these people and now they've been deterred from ever doing anything illegal again, right? One of the really cool forms of research that they've done to look at deterrence is this thing called scenario research. Basically what they do is they design a whole bunch of random scenarios, right? You're a 25-year-old male and you are really hard up for money, so you're going to go rob a 7-Eleven. And and then kind of at the end of this, they ask you, would you do it or would you not do it, right? And one of the things, they're going to give this question to a whole bunch of different people. But each person that gets the question gets a slightly different scenario. So sometimes there's a police officer in the 7-Eleven, and they tell you that before they're going, they ask you whether you would commit the crime. Other times, it specifically says there are security cameras everywhere. Other times it says there are no security cameras visible. Sometimes it says there are 2 clerks working. Sometimes it says there's only 1 clerk working, right? So all these kind of things affecting the certainty, the swiftness, and the certainty, swiftness, and severity of the punishment you might face for committing that crime. And what they found is certainty is definitely the most important, right? Again, there's very little difference in yes, I would commit the crime or no, I would not commit the crime based on the swiftness or the severity of the punishment for committing it. But certainty, yeah, there might be something there, right? But interestingly, it's not the formal sanctions that cause the most deterrent effect, i.e. it's not the prospects of getting arrested, charged, and convicted of committing a crime that cause a deterrent effect. What's really most impactful is the informal sanctions, the certainty that your mom's going to find out, the certainty that you're going to lose your job, the certainty that, something bad is going to happen to you other than the formal arrested, tried, convicted, etc. So those informal sanctions seem to be much more powerful than any kind of formal sanction. Now, here's another really interesting factor in all this research, and that is what's called the experiential effect. Okay? The experiential effect essentially just says that your behavior is influenced more by your perceptions, much more than your perception is influenced, or much more than the other way around, right? So in other words, if they asked a whole bunch of people, how likely do you think you are to get caught for committing this crime? And usually, people who have been caught for that crime rate the likelihood of getting caught for it much higher than others, right? So robbing a 7-Eleven, I might rate that at X%. Somebody who has actually been caught and convicted of robbing a 7-Eleven is going to rate their odds of getting caught much higher than I would. Because their behavior, they robbed the 7-Eleven and they got caught, thus the odds of getting caught must be really high, right? Interestingly, there are a bunch of upper class crimes where the opposite is true. People who have been caught and convicted for these crimes rate the likelihood of getting caught for these crimes much lower than the people who haven't. The two big notable examples are white-collar crimes like embezzlement, fraud, that kind of thing, and drunk driving. So if you've been arrested for drunk driving, even if you've been arrested 5-10 times, your perception of the odds of getting caught for driving drunk are actually much lower than most people's. Because by the time you've been caught driving drunk, you've probably done it 100 times, 1,000 times, right? So the fact that they have experienced this situation in which they've done something a gazillion times, never got caught, and then they finally did get caught eventually, after years and years and years of committing this crime, they're actually going to have a lower perception of their chances of getting caught than the rest of us, and less than reality, right? Another thing we have to talk about when we're talking about deterrence is this thing called stakes and conformity. We're going to talk a lot more about stakes and conformity in a much later section, but right now, stakes and conformity essentially means the more you have to lose, the less likely you are to commit crime and lose it, right? So if I have a house and 2 kids and a dog and a wife and my life is going great, a job I love, I'm going to be much less likely to commit crime because I don't want to lose all those things. I like my life, I like my job, I like my house. But somebody who has no spouse, no job, no house, they really don't have much to lose, right? So that deterrent effect is kind of least likely to influence those who we most want it to influence, right? It's precisely the people who are in that kind of situation that we most want to deter from committing crime, but they're also the least likely to be deterred because they're not, even the highest of the cons is really not that big a deal, right? Oh, I'm going to lose my crappy house or my apartment that I hate anyway, or whatever. So, yeah. Now, 2 other kind of concepts that are related to deterrence. These are kind of very, very modern policies or ways of looking at things that are both A, famous, and B, based on this idea of deterrence, right? So the first one we got to talk about is called broken windows. Broken windows is this whole philosophy where it's named after windows in abandoned buildings, right? Or what might be abandoned buildings. If a neighborhood kid throws a rock through a window, and that window is replaced quickly and easily, then it's going to be a while before another kid throws a rock through another window. But if a kid throws a rock through a window and it's not quickly replaced, pretty soon all the windows in the building are going to be broken. Because kind of the neighborhood has figured out that, nobody cares for this building. So, using that analogy, and using this to name the theory, essentially, this concept says that we need to focus on small crime, focus on the little things in any given neighborhood where there's a high crime rate, and the bigger things will kind of take care of themselves, right? So if we want to reduce crime in a neighborhood, we need to focus on vandalism and littering and prostitution and minor drug usage, things like that. And when we kind of help fix those small problems, the bigger problems won't happen. Now, this is a great theory when you say it fast, but kind of the actual impact of this has been huge increases in arresting and convicting people for minor crimes, which in many states, or in all states really, but to different degrees, can really ruin your life. Make it harder for you to get a job, make it harder for you to vote, make it harder for you to get an apartment, do all these things. So in the long term, this broken windows thing has probably caused more problems than it's fixed. Similarly, 3 strikes laws. Okay, each state, or every state that has a 3 strikes law has a slightly different version. This is not like a federal level thing. This is, some states don't have one at all. Most, I think at this point, more than half of states do, but each one of the ones that does have it, it works slightly differently. The most famous one is California's. California has a 3 strikes law, but essentially what they all say is, if you commit a certain number of felonies, your 3rd or 4th, usually it's 3rd, hence the name 3 strikes. If you commit that many felonies or are convicted of that many felonies, it is a mandatory life without parole, or mandatory life with parole, or mandatory 60 years. Again, depending on the state. Now, in some states, it has to be 3 different kind of overall crimes, 3 different dates, right? But in some states, you can commit 3 felonies in one kind of act, and that is enough to put you into that guaranteed life in prison, right? So if I, go to rob a 7-Eleven and rob the 7-Eleven, and then there's, a person in the store, and I rob them too, and then I steal their car, that's burglary, or robbery of the 7-Eleven, robbery of the customer, and car theft in one kind of act or one crime, but it's 3 felonies. So in some states, that's enough to implement the 3 strikes, life in prison. Similar to broken windows, this results in a lot of really, really intense prison overcrowding. California especially has had such a problem with way too many people in prisons that were just not designed to hold that many people. They've had to the federal government has had to step in recent years and say, like, you have to reduce your prison population, which is always tough, right? Who do you let out? But anyway, all of these, deterrence, rational choice, the broken windows of 3 strikes, all these kind of applications of deterrence, what they all kind of have in common is they all assume free will. They all assume rationality, right? They all assume people are kind of weighing the pros and the cons of committing a crime before deciding whether to do it or not. And again, it's kind of difficult to show any real deterrent effect. But if there is one, it's basically guaranteed to be focused on the certainty of punishment and informal sanctions rather than formal sanctions. So one other thing I got to talk about at the very end of this section, a lot of textbooks and criminology courses lump routine activities theory in with deterrence and rational choice. I don't usually like that, but I didn't have a better idea on where to put it for this course, so I'm throwing it into this section. Routine activities theory essentially says that there are 3 requirements for a crime to happen. The first is a suitable target. Second is a motivated offender. And third is a lack of guardianship. Whenever these 3 things come together in time and space, crime happens, right? Now, that's kind of the basic level understanding of the theory, but what it goes on to say is essentially that the way we live our lives either increases or decreases the odds of those 3 things coming together in time and space. Based on the way we live our lives, though, there are going to be certain places geographically that are going to have more crimes than others. These are called hotspots, right? And in fact, when we look at the data, sure enough, there are these hotspots for crime. Usually, bad part of town, bars, pawn shops, you know, places where people that are where motivated offenders and or suitable targets tend to spend their time, and guardians don't. Now, guardians don't necessarily have to be like a security guard or a police officer. You know, a security camera could count as a guardian. It's the light, right? Like street lights can count as guardians. But the way we live our lives collectively as a group is going to influence how often and where those three things come together, and thus where and when crimes happen. So, it's the end of that section. Thank you so much. See you next time.